Hello, and I want to thank you for inviting me to join the working group on the circular low carbon economy. And a special call out to Dr. Ann Scheinberg, who we've worked together for almost 40 years. It would be great to have the opportunity to be working together. So Ann has asked me to give an update on what's happening in the US as far as recycling. So today I'm going to talk about what I consider the perfect storm of recycling. There's a major shift that has occurred, started in 2016, is currently going on in regards to the recovery of materials. As far as our recycling rate, we implemented a number of new ways to approach recycling in the late 80s, early 90s, and you see there's a large increase in the percent of recovered material over time, as well as the percent of generation of recycling and composting at the same time. So what I'm going to cover today is actually trends that I've observed and actually participated in over the last 35 to 40 years. And these four different trends have come together to create what I call that perfect storm. The first one is the industry consolidation, that is the waste industry consolidation that has occurred in the United States over the last couple of decades. The second will be the drive for collection efficiency. When we consider cost of solid waste management, collection is often one of the largest drivers in that process. Because of the way things are collected, processing has changed, and I want to talk about how processing has changed as a result of the collection system. And finally, what has happened as far as how market specifications has changed globally, which has impacted the US recycling. So on to the perfect storm. First, the industry consolidation. The waste industry has been consolidating. That is where I first got involved in the waste management in the late 70s, early 80s. There were many private small mom and pop operations around the country. By 2016, what we saw is that there was an aggregation of these companies into three categories. The municipal companies are basically municipally run solid waste systems, or they have some kind of agreement with the private sector, but they are overseen and the money flows through the municipality directly. And then there's two types of private companies. One is privately owned companies that basically are not traded and do not have stock, and decisions are made by a small group, usually of family members. And then what you've really seen is a growth of the large public companies dominating the solid waste system, all the way from collection to disposal. Now, private haulers, as we call them, people that collect solid waste, you can see that we had a tremendous drop in haulers from, this just shows 97 to 2005, but tremendous percent of the US solid waste market as far as how money flows through really had to do with how many haulers there were and whether they were vertically integrated. And so what we've ended up with is of how all solid waste management is handled in the United States, you will see approximately between 55 and 60% of all solid waste in the United States is handled by four companies, with waste management being the largest. And so of those four companies, this is out of 56,000 companies, they control 80% of the private market. And because they're vertically integrated, they also control 75% of all landfill capacity in urban areas where most of the waste is generated. And 50% of the hauling infrastructure and 50% of the MRF capacity. MRF meaning, we call that materials recovery facilities. You here in Europe call intermediate processing centers, but they're the same thing. It's basically providing a quality control step to get materials to market. Now, what has happened to collection efficiency? Well, if you go back to the beginning, we started with source separated drop-off. The first two known eastern and western drop-offs, one was in Arcata, Oregon, and the other one was the Wellesley Recycling Center in Massachusetts, where people brought their material in. They basically had them all separated in a lot of different types of material, 3 colors of glass, multiple plastics, multiple grades of paper, etc. And there was a quality control step here where the operator would make sure the right type of material went into the right type of barrel or bucket. Then we started to see the beginning of curbside collection, especially in urban areas. EcoCycle in Boulder was really the beginning of this whole trend. And you basically set out your materials, and it really was the operator itself that basically was the quality control. They would separate things into cans, glass, paper, and plastic containers and make sure that they were put in the right containers on the truck. Then in '87, there's this sort of paradigm shift, which was driven by trying to get higher participation rates of households and higher capture rates of recyclables coming out of each of those households. And so both Ann and I were part of this effort. We were designed the first, what we call dual stream system for the state of Massachusetts. And this was parallel to a system that Victor Bell created in Rhode Island. What we did is we took what we call the blue box concept, which is actually was developed in Kitchener, Mississauga, Canada, and we combined it with what we call materials recovery facility, which grew out of the refuse-derived fuel technologies that had been established in the U.S. And most of them had closed down, but there was still one operating in Delaware. And so we combined the two to create what we call this dual stream curbside collection. And the blue boxes were signaling to people that they only had to do 2 separations, paper and containers. And thus, more people were willing to take the time to separate their materials in just 2 streams and put them out. And those streams then went into a facility with 2 sides to it. One side dealt with the paper fraction, the other side dealt with the containers. So the system we developed, I was the assistant recycling director from Massachusetts at the time, it was a public-private sector initiative where basically the operation of the collection system and the MRFs were in the private sector, but it was the public sector that financed and bankrolled the capital to do this and required certain operational metrics of quality and capture rate in order to continue. So we did increase the capture rate. The quality control of processing that is at the MRF was quite high. And for dual stream MRF, we were only getting about 5% contaminants. So that is materials that came in with the paper fraction and the containers and had to eventually go to a landfill. And the economic driver here was avoided disposal costs. And what that means is that people could recycle for free in the communities. And the materials then were created at a quality that end user industries were assured that they were getting a high enough quality of material that they could supplement or replace virgin material that goes into the manufacturing of their products, such as glass bottles or plastic containers or cardboard boxes. And our justification was that if the materials were recycled, then the cost of disposal at the landfill was avoided. And that was the sort of the economic argument for dual stream systems. And the next iteration of this went to what we call single stream, where everything was put into one container. And you also saw automation of collection so that the collection efficiency increased dramatically. That is, not only were we getting a higher capture rate of materials at the curb from the households, but the rate of collecting and transporting them also went up. So the overall collection cost per unit, whether it's per household or per ton of material, dropped significantly. Now, this idea started in California in 1995, and you can see that it didn't take long. It was on a scale of about 20 years that for urban areas, most urban situations where it was changed from dual stream or what we call source separated recycling to single stream, just because of the driver of economics. And so the thing about single stream is that everything's put together in one container. So you're collecting everything at a much higher set out rate. That is, more people will participate in the recycling program. Each household will capture more material. And thus we get a more efficient cost per ton of collection. Because of the collection, the processing of this single stream, we did find a higher contamination level. In fact, the contamination levels ranged anywhere from 15 to 50%, depending on what the MRF design was in which the collected material was going. There were higher costs of processing because of the contamination. It took more labor and more machinery to create a cleaner load or a cleaner output so that the markets, the manufacturers, would accept it. And because even though they were spending more money for a cleaner product, they weren't producing as clean a product as dual stream or source separated. So the market would pay them less for the lower quality product, so there's lower revenue. Now, with this increase in collection efficiency, you basically had this decrease in processing inefficiency, increase in process inefficiency. And so the growth in single stream processing did occur. Now, a new single stream facility greater than 500 tons per day was on the range of $8 million for the facility. And it was sized with the expectation that you're going to get a higher participation capture rate, so there's going to be more materials arriving at your front door. We call that the tipping floor. However, many communities already had a dual stream MRF. And so what they did is they decided that they were going to take single stream into the dual stream MRF. And they were going to adapt it and change it to handle single stream. And this was between $500,000 and $800,000, which is about a tenth of building a brand new single stream. So that's where most of the processing capacity went, was to revamp dual stream to a single stream facility. So one of the whole problems was that we were getting a much greater quantity of material, both from the collection efficiency as well as the set out and capture rate from each of the households. And so the design or the footprint of the dual stream MRF wasn't really designed for so much material coming in. So often it had to go outside. And once it went outside, you had sort of additional issues such as paper getting wet, and wet paper loses value dramatically in the recycling market in this regard. So a greater amount of material was being delivered, thus exceeding design capacity, which increased the cost. And the cost where you had to deal with more material, you had to maybe put on a second shift, maybe a third shift, and to deal with the material. And due to single stream collection and compaction of waste glass when it was in the packer truck, realize all the containers went in with all the paper, you basically were getting glass broken by compaction, and all the fluids within in the containers was also going into the paper fraction. And that lowered the quality of the paper fraction specifically, and thus reduced the market value of this material. And so you got a reduced revenue. And so what you were seeing here is just looking at a value chain analysis for a paper grade, where basically you see that you get a big positive impact of revenue in, or shall I say, avoided cost in collection, but the cost of processing also increased. And once you created a end product coming out of the MRF and it went to the manufacturer, such as the pulp and paper maker, the pulping facility and the paper making facility, they also had to do some kind of pre-quality control, even with the best quality materials coming out of a single stream MRF. And so there was a cost at that point. So in effect, as you move to single stream, the cost in millions of dollars a year was increased, the net cost, because of the processing offset the savings in the collection. The question then becomes, if you're getting more material, what would be that overall advantage by having more material going through the system? And as I said, we were getting higher and higher contamination levels. These are actually from Waste Management itself. And they were averaging about 16% material coming out of the recycling that had to be landfill. Not only did the cost of processing increase, but since you had to dispose more material at the landfill, the cost of disposal increased. Now, these costs were passed down to the communities. And so all of a sudden, recycling wasn't making the communities monies, it was costing them monies. And those industries like Waste Management that were vertically integrated, that had both collection systems, processing systems, and disposal systems, they were making money both at all three stages. And the municipalities were increasingly paying the bill for this new system. And so at the same time, the cost per unit of disposal, that is what we call the tipping fee at landfills, was going up because landfills were being closed. And so if you use classic, or say neoclassic cost of supply demand, as you reduce capacity, that is landfill capacity, supply is still going up. And so the price per ton of landfilling will go up. And so it was to an advantage to have these vertically integrated companies to both process the recyclables and selling it at a lower revenue because they were lower quality, but they were offsetting that with the higher tipping fees they were charging for the disposal of the contaminants that came out of the MRF. And then we started to see that the value of a commingled ton of paper, for example, or a commingled ton of plastics was dropping dramatically because the quality was lower. And so the end user industry will pay you less per ton for it because they would have to do additional processing for quality control before they could put it back into manufacturing. And so these three things came together with a massive shift in the market specifications, that is the quality demanded for materials coming out of the US. And this was known as first the China green fence, and then it finally became known as the China sword. Because the quality of the materials were dropping and the US industry end users were not wanting it, the waste companies were finding that it was cost effective actually to put them on a ship and ship them over to Asian tigers, including China. And so what you were starting to see is a significant amount of US recyclables were being exported to China. And so So in Hong Kong and China accounted for almost 70% of all US plastics exports. And approximately, for all recyclables, they took about 30% of all the recyclables that was generated in the US. Now, why is China so important? Is that if you just look at the percentage of where materials are accepted in the world, the ROW is the rest of the world, and the red is China. You can see specifically for copper scrap, that's a metal, but more importantly for us, recovered paper and fiber and recovered plastic, a majority of the material in the world is going to China. And why it was going to China is that, and why it was cost effective for US companies, is the processing costs were done by what we call the informal sector. These are the disenfranchised, both rural and urban poor, that basically will take materials and use a very high labor rich way in which to provide quality control and separate these materials into multiple grades of usable and desirable materials that go back to manufacturing. When I was working in Indonesia and working with the informal sector was recycling 50 to 55 different items. And for example, they take a steel can and separate the solder at the top of the can or at the bottom of the can, and the solder would be a different product than the can itself. So very labor intensive, but the cost of labor was so low that it was economically viable. So you had this secondary process after the MRF in the US doing this quality control step, so Chinese industry could accept it. And thus, it continued to allow the expansion of low quality recyclables from the US, and thus recyclables were moving from your households through the municipality and through the private sector's collection, processing, and transport systems to not only China, but other Asian tigers. And so US scrap exports to China versus the rest of the world. And you can see that we had depended on China for the majority of our materials as opposed to the rest of the world. The reds, especially in the 2000s up to 2016, most of them were the other Asian tigers like Malaysia, Taiwan, Vietnam, Korea, etc. And so same reason being that the labor for the final step of quality control, the cost of labor is very low, so it made economic sense for US recycling industries to send the materials overseas. And as you can see, the growth and export of plastic scrap just paralleled this. Waste import from the US was quite high and paralleled the trend. But what was happening in the US was a parallel of that, since most of the materials were no longer being made at the grade that US companies could recycle them, and it was all being diverted overseas, many of the companies that had the capacity to recycle the material went under because they just couldn't make it economically because they weren't getting enough recycled material to continue. And so the overall industrial capacity in the US disappeared during this time in which the majority of our exports were going overseas. So the China SOAR was basically an announcement by China to the World Trade Organization that China was not going to accept unsorted mixed materials, whether plastics, paper, textiles, or whatever, of a quality. And they had 4 classes and 24 kinds of scraps under the WTO's announcement. And they started to turn away shiploads of material where they were brought into port, and they would come into the port and then put it back, force it to go back on a ship and be sent back. So you were paying for transport of this material to China, and then you had to pay for the transport of the material coming back from China, and then you had to pay for the disposal of the material. So it was having a major impact on the economics of the solid waste industry. And so what you saw once the China sword hit was the amount of tonnage that was, and this is just in 2017, just after the WTO announcement, dropped off dramatically. That very little material was of the quality that could go into China. And so recycling commodity prices on the marketplace, because we didn't have these big outlets, dropped dramatically. Why? Because we had an oversupply of these materials that weren't moving, and thus the value per unit had dropped just because of supply and demand dynamics. Now, the Europeans and others were also having this issue, and everyone was saying, well, if China was closed, we will just divert our materials to other Asian tigers or other places in the world that would take it. And so that's what happened. So in the 2016, 2017, you saw many materials starting to be diverted to other countries. But it wasn't long that you saw a domino effect where these other countries primarily took the same stance as China. And so it was, in a sense, a collapsing of the world recycling commodity market because of the quality of the material that was coming out of the solid waste and recycling industries, not only in the US, but also in Europe. And as such, things were backing up, they were piling up, they weren't moving. And so because they weren't moving, there was no revenue offsetting the cost at the MRFs. And to offset those, the solid waste industry started to increase the cost of taking recyclables, even though they were sending it directly to landfills now. And so the price that cities and communities were paying the solid waste companies per ton for this material got so out of hand. In fact, so out of hand that sometimes it was higher than the cost of just throwing it into a landfill, that many cities stopped recycling or stopped recycling a large number of their materials. And so this hit the press in 2018 and has continued to be the reality of what's happening. And as a response, you're seeing these solid waste companies, which you would hope would have been a player in making sure that we were sustainable in recycling, because they were losing so much money, they started to exit and leave the recycling aspects of their businesses and just focus on collection and disposal, and which left a big gap in the US of not only no one there to process materials, but we also, because of the history, we had no processors in the US. And so this is sort of where we are today. Casella is the 5th largest solid waste company in the United States. It's actually based in Rutland, Vermont. And so some of them didn't even try anymore to send materials overseas. They just gave up and started to, even though they say they're recycling, in effect, they're out of the recycling system. And one of these overarching drivers of why the China sword was created was twofold. One is Xi Jinping basically had been hearing from his citizens that the environmental quality of the country was deteriorating, and he didn't want this to be an issue that would create a social unrest. So he, at the last National Congress, basically spent a large part of his speech on dealing with the problems, environmental problems in the country, which had never been discussed outwardly or overtly by the Communist Party, and now had been. The other thing is that there's a large growth of the middle class in China, which are producing their own products. So the industries in China that remanufacture products are getting enough supply from their own citizens that they don't need additional supply from outside the country. And so not only was this hitting us, it hit us a little earlier than Europe, but Europe followed as far as what happened to their scrap exports. And you can see that even though we're the largest, for example, scrap exporter, you know, there are many, below Japan, you can see there are many of the EU countries that are right behind us. So this was impacting the worldwide market by the change of the specifications of acceptance into China and the Asian tigers. So that was sort of the summary of what the perfect storm entailed. And I will just, I think I will leave it at that. And I think other speakers that we'll have in the class will expand upon this or touch on different aspects of this as we move forward. So I just want to say thank you, and I'll talk to you later.